Also ich freue mich erstmal, Sie heute Abend bei einer weiteren Lagebesprechung begrüßen zu dürfen. Mein Name ist Dominik Finkelde und ich habe mit Clemens Pornschläge von der LMU, das steht da drüben am Trinkautomat, die Lagebesprechung vor einigen Semestern ins Leben gerufen. Und Sie wissen vielleicht, Lagebesprechungen widmen sich Analysen im Kontext zeitgenössischer Theoriebildung an den Schnittstellen von Philosophie, Literatur und Kultur. Und darum soll es eben auch heute Abend gehen. Martin Heidegger steht dabei im Zentrum, der wohl berühmteste, aber auch wahrscheinlich umstrittenste Philosoph der deutschen Nachkriegsgeschichte. Wo sein Name fällt, das ist jedenfalls meine Erfahrung, da verändert sich atmosphärisch fast immer die Temperatur. Zumindest ist das meine Erfahrung. Sofort steht man mit einem Bein und in der Nazi-Zeit und mit dem anderen irgendwo zwischen Platon und Seinsvergessenheit oder Technikkritik. Heute aber geht es nicht um die Nazi-Zeit und also nicht um die schwarzen Hefte, zumindest nicht in erster Linie, sondern eher um ein sehr theoretisches Problem, mit das sich Heidegger Zeit seines Lebens beschäftigt hat, nämlich mit der Frage nach der Wahrheit. Was ist Wahrheit? Wie kann man den Begriff der Wahrheit definieren oder philosophisch einfangen? Das ist natürlich ein zentrales Problem überhaupt der ganzen abendländischen Philosophie. Und ich bin sehr froh, zu diesem Thema zwei tatsächlich international herausragende Philosophen der Gegenwart begrüßen zu dürfen, nämlich Paul Livingston aus den USA und Markus Gabriel. Paul Livingston lehrt an der University of New Mexico in Albuquerque und Markus Gabriel lehrt an der Universität Bonn. Bevor ich Ihnen jedoch die beiden Gäste noch genauer vorstelle, möchte ich noch kurz anmerken, wie der Abend ungefähr aussieht. Paul Livingston wird einen Vortrag von ca. 30 bis 40 Minuten halten, und zwar auf Englisch. Anschließend gibt es ebenfalls auf Englisch ein Gespräch zwischen Markus Gabriel und Paul, das Clemens und ich sich ab und zu einklinken werden. Und in der letzten halben Stunde gibt es dann die Möglichkeit zu Fragen aus dem Publikum. Ich werde ungefähr versuchen, gegen 20:30 Uhr pünktlich das Ende der Lagebesprechung einzuleiten. Und zwar auch deshalb, weil morgen eine Konferenz stattfindet, nämlich Continental Realism der Hochschule für Philosophie. Und meine beiden Gäste hatten dort auch ihre Vorträge und ich möchte natürlich, dass die morgen möglichst fit bei der Konferenz dann anwesend sind. Falls Sie Lust haben, auf dieser Konferenz morgen dabei zu sein, die beginnt morgen um 9 Uhr in der Hochschule für Philosophie, Kauerstraße, und übermorgen würde ich mich sehr freuen. Es liegen einzelne Flyer aus, oder eventuell kann ich die nachher nach der Veranstaltung noch verteilen. Und ich würde mich freuen, wenn Sie noch dazukommen würden. Der Eintritt beträgt 10 Euro. Dort kommen nämlich sehr bekannte Philosophen international, die an zeitgenössischen Debatten der Erkenntnistheorie beteiligt sind, nämlich neben Paul Livingston und Markus Gabriel auch noch Andrea Kern aus Leipzig, Ray Brassi von der American University in Beirut, Paul Grattan aus Kanada, Anton Koch aus Heidelberg, Dieter Sturmer auch aus Bonn, Peter Grattan aus England, Ian Grant aus England und Martin Kusch aus Wien.
Sebastian Rödel aus Leipzig.
Ah ja, Entschuldigung, Sebastian Rödel aus Leipzig, genau. Und ich glaube, die sind auch fast alle schon eingetroffen, es hat keine Absagen gegeben, also das wird morgen ein volles, großartiges Programm. Wie gesagt, die Konferenz beginnt um 9 Uhr. Okay, nun aber zum Thema der Lagebesprechung, eben zu Heidegger. Ich stelle Ihnen kurz Paul Livingston und dann Markus Gabriel vor. Paul Livingston ist Professor für Philosophie an der, wie ich schon sagte, University of New Mexico in Albuquerque in den Vereinigten Staaten. Und seine Arbeit konzentriert sich auf die Philosophie des Geistes, also gibt es so etwas wie Geist, Bewusstsein, wie kann man das definieren, Philosophie der Sprache, die Phänomenologie und die politische Philosophie. Und er ist besonders, finde ich, international geschätzt, weil er in beiden Bereichen der Philosophie sehr firm ist, nämlich einerseits der analytischen Philosophie und der Kontinentalphilosophie. Und wenn Sie vielleicht ein bisschen Philosophie kennen, dann merken Sie, dass es da so eine Spaltung in der Welt gibt zwischen Anhängern einer kontinentalen Philosophie und einer analytischen. Und sowohl Paul Livingston als auch Markus Gabriel sind dabei, diese Kluft zu überwinden. Paul Livingston studierte Philosophie in Harvard und Cambridge und er promovierte an der University of California at Irvine. Er hat viele Bereiche der Philosophie des 20. Jahrhunderts publiziert Und zu seinen jüngsten Publikationen zählen die Monographie The Logic of Being, die kann ich mal kurz hochhalten. Das ist sein jüngstes Buch und darum wird es auch heute Abend gehen. Bei Routledge erschienen, glaube ich. Nee, Northwestern. Genau, Northwestern University. Dann noch ein anderes Buch, das hat er mit einem Andrew Kudrow Fellow herausgegeben. The Problems of Contemporary Philosophy. Das kann ich auch sehr empfehlen. Das ist eine sehr gut geschriebene Einführung in analytische, philosophische Debatten der Gegenwart. Markus Gabriel, den werden die meisten von Ihnen kennen. Er ist Professor für Epistemologie, moderne und zeitgenössische Philosophie an der Universität Bonn. Und er gilt als Wegbereiter des sogenannten neuen Realismus, von dem es auch zumindest zum Teil auch morgen in der Konferenz geben wird. Und sein letztes Buch heißt einerseits Field of Sense, das ist die englische Übersetzung von Sinn und Existenz.
Andersrum, die deutsche Fassung ist die Selbstübersetzung des von mir geschriebenen Fields of Sense.
Achso, ja, okay. Und dann noch dein letztes Buch ist, glaube ich, Ich ist nicht Gehirn, 2015 erschienen beim Burstein Verlag. Es sei noch erwähnt, dass Markus Gabriel seit 2012 Direktor des Internationalen Zentrums für Philosophie in Nordrhein-Westfalen ist. So viel zu unseren Gästen und ich freue mich jetzt auf Paul Livingston, der uns auf Englisch in das Thema von Wahrheit bei Heidegger einführen wird. Thanks again to you and Paul and Markus that you have come all this way to be with us today. I'm very excited to hear you. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me first warmly thank Professor Finkelde and also Professor Gabriel and also everybody who has come tonight. And let me thank you also for permitting me to speak in English. So it's easier for me. So I've been asked to say something about Heidegger's idea of truth. I thought I might try to talk about some elements of this idea and how it might be useful for philosophical thinking today. In my recent book, The Logic of Being, Realism, Truth, and Time, I try to think about the relationship between truth and time. How what is true, for example, in science, art, or politics, might be thought of as changing over time, as our world and what is meaningful to us changes, while nevertheless still being actually the truth, and not just something we culturally construct or make up. In my argument, I make use of some of Heidegger's ideas, and in particular, how his ideas about truth and time are both related to what he calls being, das Sein, and to our own kind of being and living, what he calls Dasein. But the main point of my argument, I should say, is not to interpret Heidegger overall, or to defend any of his views, but to bring out some basic problems and questions in the context of dialogue with other thinkers and positions, especially in 20th century and contemporary analytic philosophy as well as historical philosophy. So in these remarks, I'll try to outline some of the elements of Heidegger's idea of truth and suggest how it might contribute to our self-understanding and also our understanding of what happens in domains such as art and science, as well as in relation to philosophical questions. Essentially, I'll argue that Heidegger's idea of truth is important because it brings out the way in which the truth of what we say or judge is itself based on the phenomenon of what appears or shows up as meaningful or significant at different times and in different conditions. As such, Heidegger's idea of truth contains the idea of the sense or meaning that things have for us, and tries to characterize the structure by which they have this sense or meaning. And it does this by relating the truths that we express back to the broad context in which we are able to say them, what Heidegger characterizes as our world, or the world. For a long time, philosophy has thought of truth, or at least the important truths that philosophy cares about, as timeless and unchanging. This way of thinking about truth begins with Parmenides, and is captured in Plato's metaphysics of forms or ideas, what are supposed to be incapable of change, but nevertheless explain the meaning of things, what it fundamentally is for something to be the way that it is. But this is problematic, since the significance of things for us changes over time, and our understanding of things changes over historical time, to the extent that we may be said to inhabit different worlds that don't contain the same entities or objects. For example, the world of the contemporary quantum physicist, inhabited by quarks, neutrinos, and wave fields is very different from the world of the medieval philosopher, inhabited by essences, angels, final causes. If we want to talk about truth, even the truth of the everyday things that we say about the people and things around us, we need to discuss these differences in the ways that phenomena show up, in the ways that things appear, in the meaningfulness of things for us. In other words, we need to talk not only about what things are and how they are related, but how the things are meaningfully presented or given for us to begin with. How they, as we might put it, can show themselves in different or varying ways in different total contexts or situations, but nevertheless can still show themselves as they, in fact, actually are. Heidegger works out of the tradition of phenomenology, which tries to describe the structure and conditions of the way phenomena, which appear to us, appear with sense, sin, meaning or significance in each case. These ways are different at different times and for different people and cultures, but that doesn't mean, I'll argue, that truth is just a cultural construction or convention. Instead, I'll argue that the phenomenological conception that Heidegger develops can combine an idea of the way that truths, understood as the ways that entities show up or are available, the way that these change over time, with nevertheless a basic realism about those conditions. How things show up is not just grounded in our own subjective decision or impression, but just as much and as deeply in the way things really are. In order to capture this phenomenological idea of truth, Heidegger uses a few different terms to talk about the ways that things show up or appear. The most general term he uses for the discussion of the phenomenon of truth is, in English, unconcealment, Unverborgenheit. This is a translation or near translation of the Greek term, aletheia, which also means bringing out of concealment, obscurity, or hiddenness, usual Greek term for truth. The idea here is not just to talk about discover what things, claims, sentences, or ideas are true, but to get at the phenomenon underlying the possibility of truth itself, the more basic phenomenon that must take place in order for us to say that any sentence or any judgment is true or false. For Heidegger, for this to happen, things must first show themselves in some way. That is, something must show up or appear as something or in some way. In Being and Time, he discusses how in a spoken or written assertion about something, we can say something about the entity itself, how the assertion can say something true about something. This depends on the assertion, the expression, being able to show how the entity is actually in itself. That is, how it really is. So for those of you who have the handout, this is the first quotation for Being and Time. To say that an assertion is true, and here he means a linguistic assertion, signifies a sentence as spoken or written, signifies that it uncovers the entity as it is in itself, an themselves. Such an assertion asserts, points out, lets the entity be seen. Here he uses the Greek terminology, apophansis, or showing, or showing up, in its uncoveredness, entdecktheit. The being true, truth of the assertion must be understood as being uncovered, as entdeckend sein. Being true, truth means being uncovering. Better in auf Deutsch, wahr sein, Wahrheit besagt, entdeckend sein. This way, the unconcealment or the uncoveredness of the entity itself is the precondition for saying anything about it, whether true or false. It's only insofar as the entity shows up or appears that we can meaningfully say anything about it at all. But that means that the showing up of the entity, the phenomenon, is an essential part for Heidegger of the phenomenon of truth, and essential to the characterization of what truth is. And what we do say about it, the entity, will be true if it is grounded in an uncovering or concealment of the entity as it is in itself. In 20th century philosophy, truth has often been understood as primarily the property of sentences or assertions. So, for example, if I say that snow is white is true, a way of analyzing this is to say that it is actually the case that snow is white, that snow has the property of being white. Obvious. One idea that is closely connected with this is that truth is a kind of correspondence or agreement, Übereinstimmung, between a sentence or judgment and the way things are in the world. For example, the sun is bigger than the moon, as a mental judgment or linguistic proposition, corresponds on this view to the actual relationship between the sun and the moon. The judgment or proposition, the apple is red, corresponds to the actual apple and is actually being red. This is fine, but in order for the sentence, the sun is bigger than the moon, to be true, we need to be able to understand the meaning of sun moon, and bigger than. And to do this, we have to have available to us in some way not only the words, but also what the words stand for. We need some way of having insight into, having access into the things themselves. That is, in this case, the sun, the moon, the relationship of being bigger than. For the sun and the moon, probably every culture and every language has some words in some way of referring to them and picking them out. But the significance or sense of how these phenomena show up can be very different at various times. Does the sun appear as a sphere of hydrogen producing energy by means of nuclear fusion? Or as a celestial body revolving daily around the Earth? Or as the wheel of Apollo's chariot? How then should we think about what determines the sense or significance of phenomena as they show up for us? According to Heidegger, this determination always takes place in a broader and total context. That is, in the context of the totality or whole of entities, which is one of the meanings of what he calls a world. When we think about the actual basis for the significant appearance of any entity, we also have to have in mind, at least implicitly, its relationships to all the other entities that surround it and with which we meaningfully engage. This total pattern of relationships is captured in the language that we may speak at a time, and goes all the way up to the total context of the world itself. And so for that reason, we have to think about the way that a whole world, as a total and holistic context, is itself disclosed or made available to us. How truth is grounded, in other words, in our relation to the total context in which we locate ourselves, the world as such. The next quotation from lecture course Logic, The Question of Truth, 1925. Truth is not a present relationship Vorhandenes between two entities that are present, zwischen zwei Seienden, die vorhanden sind, for instance, as psychical and physical. It is also no coordination, as one loves to say these days. If it is a relationship, Verhältnis at all, it is one that has no analogies with any kind of relation between entities. It is, if one can put it this way, the relationship of Dasein as Dasein to its very world. The world openness, Weltoffenheit, of Dasein, that is itself uncovered. Dasein, whose being toward the world, Sein zur Welt, itself is disclosed, aufgeschlossen, in and with this being toward its world. This uncovering is itself grounded, according to Heidegger, in the structure of Dasein as well as that of the world. In particular, uncovering is a way of being for being in the world. What is primarily true, that is, uncovering, is Dasein. Our earlier analysis of the worldhood of the world and of entities within the world has shown that the uncoveredness and Entdecktheit of entities within the world is grounded in the world's disclosedness, Erschlossenheit. But disclosedness is that basic character, Grundart, of Dasein, according to which it's there, da. In other words, entities are available to us in the holistic context of the world, because we, that is to say Dasein, are able to disclose or uncover this whole context itself through our basic understanding of the ways things are or can be. Heidegger will say that we have a projective understanding of the possibilities of ways of being of entities in the world as a whole. But we are able to do this, the uncovering or discovering of the whole context of the way things are or can be, only because we interpret or understand the sense or significance of what it is to be or exist in some particular way. In that respect, the truth of being is grounded in how we think of entities in general. But it is also, as Heidegger emphasizes, also equally grounded in how they are, that is, their being, or their ontological sense. He uses the terminology Seinsinn. When something is unconcealed or disclosed as being some way, this means that the sense of its being is also disclosed along with it. This relationship to its being is then captured in the linguistic assertion as well, if it succeeds in capturing the truth. If Heidegger is right, the phenomenon that is ultimately at the basis of the possibility of any linguistic predicate being true of its object, as well as any other phenomenon of disclosure, is the phenomenon of unconcealment, itself founded on what he calls a basic as structure, the structure by which something shows up as something. In a passage from the Basic Problems of Phenomenology, Heidegger specifies how this hermeneutic as, this something showing up, something appearing, something being disclosed as something, can be understood as the underlying basis for the is of predication, so that when I say, the apple is red, this has a deeper basis. The copula has a deeper basis in the more basic hermeneutic as structure, and indeed in the being of the things that are thereby disclosed. so far as the is in an assertion is understood and spoken, it already signifies intrinsically the being of a being which is asserted about as unveiled, als enthülltes. In the uttering of the assertion, that is to say, in the uttering of exhibition, this exhibition as intentionally unveiling comportment expresses itself, spricht aus, about that to which it refers. By its essential nature, that which is referred to is unveiled. So far as this unveiling comportment expresses itself about the entity it refers to and determines this being in its being, the unveiledness of that which is spoken of is ipso co-intended, mitgemeint. The moment of unveiledness is implied in, liegt in, the concept of the being which is meant in the assertion, das in der Aussage gemeinte Seins selbst. When I say A is B, I mean not only the being B of A, but also the being B of A as unveiled. The extant entity, vorhandene, is in a certain way true, not as intrinsically extant, but what is uncovered in the assertion. On Heidegger's account, it is therefore the basic way in which an entity, in its being uncovered, is shown as something that provides the ultimate phenomenological basis for the explicit is of predication. So I say the apple is red. This has a basis in the apple showing itself as red, as being in some way. Or indeed the inexplicit structure of predication, and no form of the predicative to be is present in the sentence. It is thereby possible to see the predicative structure as phenomenologically grounded in the more basic as structure, which is in a fundamental way not relational or synthetic, but rather just a question of the disclosure, the appearance of the entity in and in relationship to the total context of entities that surround it and give it its sense. How then do entities first become available to us? And so here we should think about cases where we have not had a term or phenomenon. Think of the phenomena of contemporary physics, the Higgs boson, for example. This is something that doesn't exist and can't even be referred to 500 years ago. How do they become available? How do entities show up? In the 1928 treatise on the essence of ground, or Wesen des Grundes, Heidegger describes the way in which the availability of entities for reference and description is grounded in the phenomenon of projection, whereby Dasein opens a particular domain for a projective understanding of the being of beings. The condition for this opening is found in what Heidegger calls the structural transcendence of Dasein, whereby it is already outside itself in its original relation to truth as unconcealment. In this sense, according to Heidegger, the availability of any domain of entities is conditioned by a prior interpretation that makes accessible a particular domain on the basis of an interpretation itself grounded in Dasein's understanding of being. In this interpretation, new entities may enter the world through sudden shifts that allow something of the character of a domain of beings that was hitherto obscure to appear. The phenomenon of world entry is thus to be characterized as a basic possibility of Dasein, insofar as Dasein is world-forming, that is, structured by a basic transcendence that relates it also to the ontological difference, that is, the difference between entities and being itself. So to summarize, Heidegger thinks of the basic phenomenological condition for the truth of statements or judgments as the prior appearance of entities. This appearance happens in the holistic context of the world, and can only happen insofar as we, the beings that he calls Dasein, form a prior or projected interpretation of entities as a whole and as such, das Seiende als solches im Ganzen. He calls this capacity for prior interpretation the capacity of Dasein for world forming or world formation. So, Dasein, quotation, Dasein transcends means, in the essence of its being, it is world forming. Weltbildend, forming in the multiple senses that it lets world occur, and through the world gives itself an original view, Anblick, a picture that is not explicitly grasped, yet functions precisely as a paradigmatic form, Vorbild, for all manifest beings, among which each respective Dasein itself belongs. Das evaluate Dasein selbst gehört. Beings, such as nature in the broadest sense, could in no way become manifest unless they found occasion to enter our world. This is why we speak of their possible and occasional entry into world. Entry into world is not some process that transpires in those beings that enter it, kein Vorgang, eingehenden Seienden, but is something that happens with beings, sondern etwas, das mit dem Seienden geschieht. But what is it to form a world? In the 1930s, Heidegger replaces the earlier conception of truth as grounded in Dasein's transcendence with the diachronic, cross-temporal conception of a plurality of successive historical periods or epochs. The idea here is that in the history of Western philosophy, at least, the interpretation of entities has taken different overall forms at different times. These interpretations take the form of interpretations of what is the highest and most characteristic kind of entity, the kind of entity that is most in being, in that it is most stable and enduring. So, for example, in Plato's philosophy, the highest and most characteristic kind of entity is the form, or the idea. In Plato's philosophy, in Aristotle's philosophy, the basis of beings is thought as their substance. In medieval Christian philosophy, God is understood as the summa ens, or highest entity. And in modern philosophy after Descartes, the conscious subject is understood as setting the ultimate standard for what it is for entities to be or to exist. In each of these epochs, the nature of being is determined in a different and specific way, but Heidegger thinks that each such determination is nevertheless a determination of the being of beings, and is grounded also in some way in that kind of in being itself, das Sein, in the way it shows up or appears, even if in a somewhat veiled or somewhat obscure way in each case.
Entschuldigung, die an der Küche, es ist etwas störend. Ich wäre Ihnen dankbar, wenn Sie ein bisschen leiser sein könnten, weil sonst versteht man den Vortrag nicht so gut. Vielen Dank.
So, to summarize, and then I briefly finish, Heidegger understands the truth of sentences as always relative to the total context of the possibilities of entities to show up or be unconcealed. And he understands this total context as changing over time in ways that are nevertheless grounded in being itself and our essential relationship to it. Most generally, truth is then the total phenomenon of unconcealment as determining the conditions of how beings show up and also how we can meaningfully deal with and speak of them. These conditions change over time, but always depend on some kind of idea or conception of the overall character or sense of things. Now I'll just say something brief about why truth, if it is understood this way, must also apparently have a logically paradoxical structure, and what consequences this might have. This goes beyond the letter of what Heidegger himself says, most of the time. But it appears to be, as I argue in the book, implicit in what he says about the structure of truth and the interpretation of beings as such and as a whole. As we've seen for Heidegger, every language and every interpretation of beings so far, at least those that he understands collectively as the history of metaphysics, involves some kind of interpretation of this whole, that is, of the totality of everything that is. This interpretation of the whole is a projection of Dasein's interpretation of the nature of beings, which is ultimately grounded in being itself and our relationship to it. If we think about this totality as everything that can be referred to by means of a given language at a given time, how can we think about the structure and basis for this projection of the totality of entities? One part of the answer is that in performing this projection or institution, or this formation of the world as such, Dasein's disclosure of the world must be paradoxical, in the sense that it must both take place inside and outside the world that is thereby projected and disclosed. Dasein, in one sense, is an entity of being within the world, and on the other hand, we project the totality of entities, all of them, as if from a position outside. Dasein is itself an entity. Its self-interpretation, then, is part of the total disclosure of formation of the world in each case. So if you want to consider the disclosure of entities and the projection of world, that is, the phenomenon of truth, we have to consider this paradoxical structure or status of the basis or institution of sense or meaning. We can think about this paradoxical structure by thinking about problems involved in the limits of language, especially when language is used, as it must be, to discuss itself. When we consider words like being, meaning, and truth, we have to consider that they are general enough to characterize, in addition to the phenomena that they describe, also themselves. So that, for example, if we want to describe the being of everything that there is, we also have to include language itself as something that is. Or if we want to describe the overall structure of truth, we try to do so by means of a description that will itself be true. As I argue more fully in the book, the overall structure of truth then has the form of an overall reflexive paradox. A little bit like the paradox of the speaker, who says, everything I say is false. Or like Russell's set theoretical paradox of the set of all sets that are not self-membered. If we understand this in the context of Heidegger's concept of truth, it means that the projective disclosure of world at the basis of truth is possible only insofar as Dasein is itself a paradoxical being, both within and without it, both within and outside the field of truth that it projects. As I argue in the book, a consequence of this is that the overall sense or meaning of things must be undecidable. There is no standard or measure that can ultimately determine meaning overall in an unequivocal and also non-contradictory way. Every time we try to find a standard, rule, or structure that will determine the sense and meaning of things around us and the language we use overall, we find that the standard cannot decide on its own value or its own sense in a non-contradictory way. What this suggests is that in an important way, it is impossible to determine the meaning of things or the sense of the world overall in a single way. If there isn't any total realm of sense that is consistent in this way, it seems that in an important sense there is no consistent totality that we can call the world as such. And that means that when we consider our meaningful being in the world, we also have to learn to live with its contradictory structure. But I would argue that this nevertheless doesn't mean that we must or even can avoid understanding our life as just that, a structure of being in the world, where world always means something involving the overall sense or meaning of things in our relation to it. There may be here a point of discussion with Professor Gabriel, who has argued in his excellent book, Fields of Sense, that it is incoherent to suppose that there is the world as a totality of entities, that there is any such thing as the world as the totality of entities. And accordingly, that the sense or meaning of things is always within one of many fields of sense. In this sense, anything that we might characterize as the world is, for Professor Gabriel, as I understand him, necessarily incomplete and does not include everything in any meaningful sense. Though I use some of the same arguments with respect to the world to establish that the world is either incomplete or inconsistent, I try in the book to explore some of the consequences of the latter option, namely that there is a totality of entities. However, every stabilization of total sense is itself foundationally inconsistent, and thus bears within itself the possibility of its transformation into something else. As I suggest, this possibility goes as far as the possible transformation of what Wittgenstein called our collective forms of life, Lebensform. That is, the dominant modes of organizing life, activity, and social and technological practice. But it also suggests a different way in which our practices are, as such, always situated within and subject to the problems, paradoxes, and aporias of these forms.
Also ich habe ein paar Fragen, aber ich würde sagen, wir steigen gleich ein, weil die eine Frage ging ja schon direkt an dich. Und dann, wir haben leider nur ein Mikrofon, das heißt, wir müssen irgendwie ein bisschen darauf achten, dass wir gegenseitig uns die Mikrofone dann reichen. Okay, los geht's.
Well, I'd probably better speak in English, right? Then everyone is on the same page, unless you're totally fine with German. Then I don't know. Yeah. What do people think of the room?
You understand? English is better, auch für ihn und damit wir eine Sprache haben.
Yeah. Until a couple of years ago, it used to be a language of emancipation. Now I feel bad speaking English, but okay. So it's a shame. Well, okay. Be that as it may, so now we're doing this in English, and also in Heidegger context, you shouldn't, like it's in a Heidegger context. Don't say that German is a better philosophical language and has certain consequences. Okay, that's as much as I want to say about the propaganda aspect of Heidegger, but it will probably come back in one way or another. So let me just say a few words. I mean, there are so many points that we have in common, like in the book, and we've you know, this goes back to earlier conversations we had, and Paul was nice enough to come to Bonn when I had the manuscript down on Fields of Sense, and we discussed it in detail, and etc., etc. So there's a lot of common ground, but I want everyone roughly on the same page, and then you see where we part ways maybe. So it's not like superficially, obviously, where what we say is clearly incompatible on various interesting levels. So these are alternatives to deal with a very similar problem. But you know, like often in philosophy, when things look superficially contradictory, there might not be, right? I mean, so let's see where the conversation leads us. But yeah, so let me just first try to highlight, right, the possible disagreement, because this makes things more interesting in this kind of setting rather than trying to agree with you or give you a version of what I say that looks like less in disagreement with your proposal. Okay, so I will not say a lot. We might come back to this, to the reading of Heidegger. So I don't think Heidegger is a realist, so just a few words. I think he's an anti-realist on all interesting issues, and but he's trying to be a realist for the reasons that you work out. That's why I think that Heidegger's thought is profoundly incoherent, not inconsistent in some acceptable way. It's just incoherent. He doesn't get his act together on like no level. But that also makes him interesting, and I think what you say about Heidegger, your reading of Heidegger, is a very interesting proposal standing on its own. So I want to engage this line of thought. So yeah, clearly I would want to say there's no being in the world. When I say the world doesn't exist, you know, I'm not kidding. So I think there's no, as you nicely put it, so the minimal thesis that I would like to defend is that there's no interesting thing in which there's something like a totality of beings, totality of fact, or totality or whatever. There's no interesting metaphysical sense. At most, it would be technical to show why this doesn't even hold, but okay, so for the metaphysicians in the room, at most, I give you a boring universal quantifier. Talk about everything, all right, but at most, it's boring, okay? That's all I can give you. Roughly the idea is this, right? If you talk about absolutely everything, also when Heidegger talks about das Seiende im Ganzen, or a world, which is crucial for Heidegger, he wants to say something more meaningful, right? I mean, everything, something along the lines of, you know, everything is water. That would be surprising, right? You thought there was like Munich and Donald Trump and Intifada and stuff like that, but it turns out everything's water. That would be surprising, right? That's surprising metaphysics. And then the next guy around the corner will say, no, there's also fire, earth, and air, and then, you know, they start having a debate, and that's the history of metaphysics. And I think everyone in the history of metaphysics was wrong. Okay? So this entire history is just a history of provable mistakes. Okay? However, right, there are interesting ways of trying to fix the problems. Once we have the logical tools of the 19th and 20th centuries, of which Paul makes very interesting use in his work, we can try to fix that. But I think it's hopeless to try to fix that. This is where the disagreement lies. So I think we just have to give up on the idea that either metaphysically there is a totality, regardless of the human being's presence in the cosmos, or with the human presence in the cosmos. I think neither with nor without a human presence, things form a totality of any kind. That's the claim for which I have worked out arguments, which draw on some insights of Heidegger's too, in a different way. So this is where clearly the disagreement is. And I would, this is why also I would claim that, I mean, this has consequences for what you say at the end of your talk, right? So how do we think a change in world now in this language, right? Your proposal, I think, is roughly Hegelian. So a total, any totalizing view will reveal sooner or later an inconsistency. And a rational way of dealing with such an inconsistency, or in any event an inevitable one, will be to try to fix that, right? This is how I read Hegelian dialectics, both in the phenomenology of spirit and in the logic, and also in the encyclopedia. So there's a contradictory overgeneralization, you know, everything's water, and the next guy around the corner will say, no, not everything is water, right? My thought that everything is water isn't water, and you know, stuff like that, and then philosophy gets going, and everyone is trying to fix the closure paradoxes of the ancestor view. I think this is Hegelian dialectics, and this has, of course, very interesting ramifications. What I would want to propose is a very different way of looking at the history of metaphysics. I think the world, as I put it in the German version of Fields of Sense, is a source of nonsense, Unsinnsquelle. So I think that whenever you try to say what absolutely everything has in common such that it gives you a sense in which these things are, whenever you give an answer provide an answer to the question, what is it that Angela Merkel, pubic hair, the Intifada, Donald Trump, and the number 7 have in common, so that they all are, right? They seem to have something in common, and I think any possible response that you're trying to give to this, at best, that's the view, right? At best boils down to something boring, right? But I think that even that doesn't work out. So, like, even if you try to be like, oh no, this is just a logical claim about universal quantifiers.
But the association, your association of Angela Merkel and pubic hair is not boring. That's why it wasn't a metaphysical claim, right? It would be the metaphysician makes the co-presence of Angela Merkel and pubic hair in Berlin. Generally, I'm not talking about her pubic hair. I'm like a German public. I work for the government. I don't criticize it. Blah blah blah. Be that as it may, right? So the co-presence of these kinds of entities in the city of Berlin. The metaphysician will say, oh yeah, don't worry. I mean, what they have in common is, for instance, they have just both been mentioned, right? That's Gegenstandstheorie, currently represented, I think, in the most sophisticated form by our common friend Graham Priest, the theory of objects. Oh, they're both objects. And now you ask him, well, what's an object? Well, whatever I can mention. I just mentioned that, right? Now, look what this gives you. This gives you a worldview of the following form, right? Had no one ever mentioned anything, there wouldn't have been any objects. Now, that's not a good view, right? That means that human beings, by mentioning stuff, turn everything into existence. So you have to be a realist about that. I mean, this is where I think we both start. So how can you be a realist and hold interesting metaphysical views? And generally, let me just give you roughly my argument, and then we engage in a debate, right? So my kind of argument has the following form, right? So, so here's my account of world entry, which isn't quite world entry, of entry. So here's my account of entry. So what enters Munich, okay, is subject to all sorts of, because it's a city, meaningfully articulated, standards. How do you get into Munich? Well, you can be a building in Munich. The buildings of the Ludwig Maximilian University are also part of Munich. You can be a building in Munich, but then you're subject to certain laws, right? You can be traveling through Munich, etc. There are different ways of making an appearance in Munich. And when you make an appearance in Munich, I say that you exist. When the number 7 makes an appearance in the series of natural numbers, it exists. But the sense in which something can make an appearance in Munich and the sense in which the number 7 can make an appearance in series of natural numbers are clearly not the same sense. Okay. And I think if there were such a thing as a totality, there would have to be an overall entry point. And I think that problem cannot be fixed. Okay. So what I'm saying is the co-presence of pubic hair and Angela Merkel in Berlin is not subject to an overall metaphysical rule. They hang together in various ways, these two kinds of objects, but not because for them to exist is something generally accessible. This gives me critical tools, so let me stop that there. So we probably have common enemies. That's why we both have flirtations with Heidegger, such as bad forms of naturalism. So for something to exist, and this is clearly where I think we both disagree with Graham Priest too, for something to exist is not for it to be part of the causal web of the universe. So that's out of the question. For me, that's a priori, right? Naturalism is false a priori because it's a view about everything. I don't have to do much more work to show that it's not the case that futuristic unified physics, whatever that would be, knows everything there is to know. This is hopeless. But equally, solipsistic subjective idealism would be hopeless, something of the form, right? If you could only call God,
then he would know what is the case. Don't call the futuristic physicist, also she doesn't exist, but maybe God, also she doesn't exist, but okay, so but people have thought she does, and she did, and so you could call up her. And I think if you call it, like even a direct landline to God wouldn't help you in metaphysics, I think. Yeah. I think God is, as a subject, just in a different, had she existed, she would have been in a different position from ours, but in no better position. I think God, metaphysically, is no better off than any other earthworm. These are consequences of all of this. And so in one word, yeah, this is the most profound disagreement with Heidegger. We are just, no one is Weltbild. So I think Heidegger's entire anthropology, yeah, he doesn't want to call it an anthropology, he's always punky with his terms, whatever, it's just an anthropology, he just calls it by a different name. But I think his entire anthropology is fundamentally flawed, which is what he realizes at some point too, right? When he starts criticizing the Weltbilder. So this is another tension in Heidegger's view. But that would be Heidegger, so I really, yeah. So, but that's roughly what's going on. And, but deep down, I mean, deep down there are of course logical issues to be settled, which make a superficial appearance here maybe, but let's see. So that's, I hope there's a way in which you can grasp what might be at stake, if I put it in this way, after Paul's very clear exposition of his view.
Great. Great, thanks so much. Yeah, so I have a lot. I'll try not to say too much. But so I think first of all, I would say I agree with the overall characterization that Heidegger is not a realist. But as you also said, that he's trying to be, doesn't get it together. And so what I tried to draw in the book is actually not a detailed exegesis of Heidegger's position, or what does he say about the dependence of truth on Dasein in particular, but rather the relationship that he also sometimes suggests, more basic, I think, in a certain way, between truth and the ontological difference between being and entities. So I basically restrict myself methodologically to the question of what significance does the ontological difference, that difference between being itself and entities, things that are, have for the question of the overall structure of truth. So that said, I mean, I think I agree also very much with your characterization of where the differences are, but with respect to what between us, with respect to the various things and phenomena that Heidegger associates with world. And here I would like to nuance also my starting point a bit as well in the book is really not a project. It's not conceived as a project of metaphysics in the traditional sense of description of the totality of entities or characterization of the totality of entities, nor just an interpretation of the quantifiers. So rather, I actually, and especially the resources that I draw from analytic philosophy, I'm interested in this, in the structure of a language at a time. And this is, as I sort of tried to emphasize, I think Heidegger is interested in this as well, and the fact that languages do change. And as languages change, they allow for fundamentally different sorts of entities to show up, to be disclosed, to appear. And so, on one level, I think I take Heidegger's project, or it can be read in any case, as almost as a project actually rather in philosophy of language or semantics, rather than simply metaphysics in this kind of sort of sense. And then, so I guess I would pose back the question, okay, so metaphysically, or on metaphysical grounds, I think essentially, you're denying the existence of the world. That is to say, there is no being in the world. There is no Dasein als Weltbild. There are all these, all these phenomena that Heidegger associates with world don't occur for you. But so I would ask then about some, not just simply the question of the metaphysical totality of entities, but I would ask about the question of the totality of what a language can do at a time. And so here, Priest's reference to whatever I can make mention or make reference to is actually useful, because we have logical tools, the semantic tools for studying the structure of a language overall. with respect to, to the totality of its reference, and we know that changes over time. And we have, there we have tools that are both linguistic, drawn from linguistics, and perhaps empirical, psychology, but also from formalizations such as, for example, as I draw in the book, Tarski's formalization of the structure of truth, the truth predicate for a language. And so I guess I would pose the question: well, can you then characterize this kind of shift, namely broadly shifts in meaning, shifts in significance, and more broadly in terms of your overall view, your no-world view? Well, we have these plural fields of sense, right? But can you characterize the genesis, the institution, the constitution of the fields of sense? And what relationship does that have to the questions in philosophy of language and formal semantics? And that's where I just want to point out, and again, I think there are the arguments that I use for in thinking about this totality, the beings as a whole and as such, are very similar to the arguments that you use. Right, but whenever we have an antinomy or a paradox, right, we can draw two conclusions: either that about the totality of the world, either that totality does not exist, or that it exists inconsistently. And if we have good reason to think that our language already commits us to its existence, then it's at least worth exploring the second route. I don't say there's any kind of knockdown argument or overall kind of conception that forces it, right? But I think we do talk about, for example, truth. We do talk about being, right? And this is part of our language, and our language has that structure of totalizing in and of itself.
I also have a question for both of you, because you give rather very favorite interpretation of unconcealed as a concept. Yeah. And I would like to know from you, Markus, how's your relation? Do you think the concept makes sense, or is it mystical? It refers a little bit to your question how to deal with dialectics within the theory of fields of sense, because it is a dialectical theory that it's like an Möbius strip or a Gestalt switch. Truth has something to do with that, and I think that's also your question: how do you deal with these kind of experiences of truth as unconcealed?
Well, these are, it's clearly not a coincidence that I will begin my talk tomorrow with a denial of the existence of language. So yeah, there's no such thing as English or German or a culture. So of course but I have to. So this is just spelling out a consequence, right? I think you're pointing your finger on exactly the right spot. So this is where a second bout of the action will take place. So totally so I think this is a very important point. So I have to say this. Yeah.
Can you repeat the spot for the audience?
Okay, so the idea is this, right? So imagine you could say something like, look, there's a language, right? Say German or physics or whatever, right? So imagine you think of a language and you fix the meaning of the word language with the help of linguistics, right? That was your proposal. And you also were open-minded, or psychology, or whatever, right? So, or semantics. So, you go Berkeley. You go to Berkeley and you talk to Davidson and Tarski and so on, and they have interesting ways of trying to do this, right? Or MIT or whatever, right? So there are projects which try to deal with this, right? And of course I have to think that these projects are failures, and fundamentally I think that what they miss is I think the reality of speaking is studied by, say, linguistics, and I think it's a property of every model. Linguistics has a model, right? Linguistics is not just more language. There are paradoxes, right? Linguistics creates new sentences. So every sentence of linguistics, the discipline, that's something we know from linguistics is very likely never to have occurred before, right? So many that we know from Chomsky, that most of the sentences that Chomsky writes down are sentences that no one ever mentioned before. So that's occasion for, that triggers paradoxes. two interesting paradoxes of this form. But so let's imagine, so abstract from this and idealize away from this problem and say, look, okay, that's a problem, but imagine we have fixed it in some way or other, and then we have linguistics for English, say. And I think what's going to happen always is that at best, we get a glimpse of paradigmatic samples. So you come up with samples and say, look, this is the language, right? So this is paradigmatic. Typically philosophers' cases, right? Atomic propositions, the cat is on the mat, and so on, right? The philosophers' examples and linguistics examples are not typically the tough ones, right? The example is not usually T.S. Eliot and then just, you know, a whole poem, but at most like a line from it. Time passed, what does he mean by that? Whatever. So, and I think that the reality of language is such, it has the logical shape of my model. So I also offer a model. Like, I don't want to say that, oh, these people, they all have models. I take off the glasses and now I'm the only realist in the room. That would be a bad view too, right? That would be speculative realism. So that's not what I'm doing. Just take off the glasses and be done with models. Don't do theory construction. That's not the way to do it, yeah. And we totally agree on that. So I also have a model, so I have to establish that my model has certain virtues that other models might not have, right? And here the virtue is that my verdict is going to be, language is going to be always more complicated, actual language, than any linguistics ever. So I think linguistics is running always behind language. So a language is always where linguistics has not yet been. And that's constitutive of linguistics. I think this is good news for linguistics, like with physics, right? The universe is always where physics hasn't been yet. Otherwise, it would also not be an empirical science. Those are the virtues that I would associate with my claim. But yeah, so in a similar tone of voice in which I say the world does not exist, I will also add further statements of the form. Language doesn't exist, culture doesn't exist, the people doesn't exist, the government doesn't exist, society doesn't. So yeah, because all these totality words, you know, I have to get rid of them for logical reasons. So that's.
Unconcealable.
Oh yeah, unconcealable. Yeah. Well, that's a tough one because now we might have to talk about Heidegger. I think so. Here's, I think, the reasonable bit that I associate with the unconcealed stuff from phenomenology. So here's, I think, where something reasonable is going on. I need a notion of reference. So imagine I have a, you know, like Heidegger is doing logics, and I think that's good, right? So, and Heidegger realizes that you can't be an inferentialist. Heidegger knows, like any good logician, that random is false a priori. So random is an inferentialist. He thinks that the meaning of terms in a syllogism is fixed by the form of the syllogism, right? So if you think, for instance, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, whatever, right? So, or complex syllogisms, when you run through your syllogism, the meaning, he thinks that, really, it's that crazy, the view. The meaning of Socrates is fixed by the position that the term Socrates occupies in all valid inferences. So he does, he gives truth and reference away, explicitly so. Now I think that's exactly not Heidegger. I think Heidegger and Husserl, they want to say, no, you can't, the very idea of logical validity is a function of your prior grasp of meaning in your term. And any prior grasp of meaning is going to be one of reference. But reference is not, as Heidegger says, a bridge between land and sea, as he calls it. So there's that's not what reference is. Something in my mind and stuff out there, and then we need a bridge between the real and the ideal or whatever. That's just ridiculous. Heidegger, I think, is a direct realist about reference. This is where the realism is. But he's not a realist about truth. That's the crazy bit. So given that Heidegger is a direct realist about reference, when it comes to complex thought, propositions, inferences, there he's an anti-realist. That's the vibe that Brandon picks up from Heidegger. And I think that's deeply incoherent. And I think the same happens to Husserl. I think that's a good definition of phenomenology. They have a good notion of reference and a terrible logic. Not you, because you're not a phenomenologist, but I think.
Right. I mean, I guess I would just then ask, you know, you say you have a model. The model is not a model of any of these generalizing words. I guess I would ask how you distinguish the general things that you want to that you don't model from the things that you can model. And you know, even these statements of generality, language does not exist, you know, the world does not exist, right? They're puzzling because they appear to be themselves meaningful statements. And so I think, you know, so again, we have options. My point is only that we have options, right? We can make this denial, but we can also understand to some extent the structure of these apparently, you know, ultimately paradoxical, ultimately reflexive problems. And the suggestion was just that, that again, it's not necessarily Heidegger, it's not the bridge between land and sea, but rather that we can see the phenomenon that he's calling unconcealment in terms of this structure of paradox. And so then I still ask, I mean, I think I return to this question of, you know, for you, with your model, if it is a model, of fields of sense, right? What can we say about how these are constituted, how they're instituted?
Let me say something about this. This is the dialectics and Genesis question that I get all the time.
Not necessarily. I don't read him as dialectical.
No, not at all. No, of course not. No, clearly not in that sense. Your model of transformation, I think, is one which draws on Heidegger, and this, that's very different. No doubt. I know lots of people, some of them recently died, and some of them are still alive, who were actually slapped by Heidegger because they said that there's dialectics in Heidegger. And Heidegger would slap you for this one. Werner Bayerwalters, for instance, was slapped, and Rüdiger Buchner, Gadamer, and Fulda. Those are the 4 people who told me the same story when they said, this is dialectics, boom. And Fulda once asked him, well, I agree with all the things that you say about time and being in time, but still, I have a watch, there's physical time, my friend. And then Heidegger said, he's reported to have said, this is not Heidegger's question. Dies ist Heideggers Frage nicht. To which Fulda replied, that's correct, it's Fulda's question. But he didn't get an answer, unfortunately, so we don't know what he would have said about this. Okay, so what about this? So I think that some fields of sense are eternal. I'm a Platonist about numbers and so on. So some are eternal, some are genetic. Now, can I answer from the standpoint of philosophy, can I answer the question, what is the genesis of a field of sense? Well, clearly not in general, right? But also like locally. No, I think these are straightforwardly empirical questions. So I think that what's the genesis of the field of sense of Munich? Well, what the heck do I know, right? I mean, what the Bavarians are after, right? I mean, and how this came to be. I think this is such a complex field of sense that it's pretty close to impossible to like ever understand how that could, you know, like this is just way too complex an object, and let alone. So I think I think these are like really empirical questions. But in a complicated sense. Empirical now must not mean like ask your favorite sociologist, because I think that many disciplines that call themselves empirical are metaphysical. I think huge chunks of theoretical physics is basically a priori metaphysics, but it looks empirical because some of the terms in the model are guaranteed to refer because they are measurements. I think big chunks of contemporary theoretical physics are mixed bag. They're not as empirical as they ought to be. So to say something maybe provocative, but not that provocative in these blogs here, there's some sense in which I might be a logical positivist. I don't know if this matters, but maybe Hannes Leipzig would be happy to hear that there's another logical positivist.
So, I mean, again, I would just, I guess, point out or suggest that because you don't characterize you don't give an account of the genesis or institution of fields of sense or of sense as a whole, you also can't give an account of the transformation of sense as a whole.
No, not as a whole.
So you know, in terms of the kinds of things that people occasionally, you know, like Heidegger have called world transformation or radical shift, even in the political domain as well, because I think this is you know important. I mean, one way of thinking about the potentiality of revolution or political transformation is as this complete shift in meaning, but that's not accessible to you.
Yes, exactly. No, that's I think part of this project is profoundly political. Now, of course, I mean, this is also where the minds meet here, right? So I would want to say this is the wrong model for revolution. This is exactly the model for revolution that is so well understood by those who do not want any revolution that it's completely under control. If this is the model of revolution, there's not going to be one.
Which model are you talking about?
Well, the idea of total transformation. This is clearly Heidegger's model of revolution, right? Heidegger clearly thinks that with the National Socialists, there's a profound shift in the meaning of being. That's what he. That's what.
But you.
Yeah, or Zizek and Badiou, etc., etc. That's roughly the same kind of view. I think this is profoundly misguided. However, I have a kind of substitute for this, right? But this comes from a totally different direction. So here's the substitute version of it, which is, you know, like that's okay. Ideology happens. So something that ought not be the case. So when I say ideology, I don't use it as a neutral term, okay? I think of a kind of fairly large-scale self-illusion of agents when I talk about ideology. False consciousness, false. Not like a little bit correct, but just false consciousness. Okay, now false consciousness is a function, I think, of worldviews. So I think ideology is exactly the thought that there are worldviews. And competing ideologies, right? Weltanschauung, as they said in the Weimar Republic, using a term coined by Kant in the Third Critique, Weltanschauung, worldviews, as they combat each other, Weimar Republic style, etc., are really just clashes of ideology, one mistake next to the other. And I think that this will be my diagnosis of the political situation, die geistige Lage unserer Zeit. I think what's happening is exactly this, that those who resist welcome change in light of obvious moral ideas of equality and freedom, okay? Those who do evil know this, and they sell worldviews. I think we're in an era of the explicit production of worldviews. So we are up against metaphysics once again, but this time it has yellow hair. And not just yellow hair, right? It comes Maoist ideology, etc., etc. So this is like pretty much omnipresent. That's part of why I think, again, saying what the possible virtue of the model is, right? So this was not just a first order political view. I'm trying to draw consequences of the model.
So yeah, I mean, let me say, I would agree with that completely as a description of ideology and as a description of the current situation. And so part of the problem, and this is really a question for me, is, you know, very clearly it is not a question today of let's institute a new worldview, let's transform our worldview into something else. It cannot be. And the significance of this, what I really want to draw out, is not that kind of call for more worldview philosophy or something like that, but rather the recognition that every worldview, every ideology is at bottom formally inconsistent.
And there we agree.
Totally. And that means unstable. And also that there is, I mean, insofar as there is a politics here for me, it is a critical politics. Only a critical politics.
That's very clear.
I
just have much less hope in the transformation there, right? So I think the transformation is not coming from within in this way, right? So I mean, your prediction. I mean, we can try to make predictions in interesting ways, right? I mean, so our models are testable empirically in a certain sense, right? I mean, if your prediction is right, the kind of predict, then inherent. So a transformation can be an inherent transformation, and I think it cannot be an inherent transformation in the same way. I think I think it's unfortunately totally stable logically, right? To think of an eternal continuation of just one stupid ideology, like North Korea forever or whatever, right? So it would just be terrible and inconsistent. But Kim Jong-un doesn't care, right? Of course it's consistent. So what? There are concentration camps. So what? That's exactly the point there. So, but it would be great if dialectics would turn out correct. That would be great.
I have a last theoretical question for both of you, and I think then we open up the debate to the audience. You focused on your book, but also in your talk, on the paradox of self-enclosure. And I think this is a very interesting thought or concept in Heidegger, because I think that's his idea also in ontologische Differenz, that every time that when the mind reaches out to the world, it is in the paradoxical structure of self-enclosure. And in that sense, I don't see him as a totalitarian thinker, even if he has, of course, when he talks about Weltbild, what he mentioned several times, that he has nevertheless an idea that there's a world out there, or at least a meta structure that we have to refer to. But I think his main idea is this paradox of self-enclosure, and that's why he referred to Russell and all these paradigms. So I wonder a little bit, how can you deal with your theory of fields of sense? Are these theories of fields of sense, are they touched by it, or because sometimes it appears that we are very at home in these fields of sense, and where you don't define, at least as far as I can judge, the paradox of that every field of sense opens up. It's a little bit a question to you, maybe.
Yeah, because I mean, not only are we beings in the world, and this is important, right? Insofar as it's meaningful at all to talk about beings in the world, and of course, I say no. But also when we think about the resources of our language, when we think about the resources of our internal, conception or consideration of truth, language, and meaning, right? These are formally, things that are marked by this kind of non-closure, this kind of openness, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, the ontology that I'm proposing, the model, okay, obviously claims to be true. So then it's both glasses and without glasses, right? That's truth. This is just the transparency of truth, formally represented as P if and only if P is true. So that's the form it has. If such and such is the case, you have the liar. Yeah. Well, that's the question. Yeah. Okay. You seem to have the liar, but you don't, because the liar defies this principle. So I think there's a good ad hoc solution to the liar, right? I mean, the liar is a formal problem. If truth is a formal property, you get the liar. That's correct.
Explain what the liar is.
Okay, the liar is this. So here's the simple liar. Okay, here's a statement. Let's call it statement. So the statement, and the statement says this statement is false. If statement is true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. Okay, so now here you have. And this means that it's not subject to your rule, P if and only if P is true. Because here you have P if and only if P is not true. Yeah. So it means your model is, to say the least, deeply incoherent. You have to do something, right? This doesn't come for free. You can't be like, on a formal level. So if truth is a formal property, which is attractive, because then you can say, well, truth. Heidegger has a tendency to such a minimalism, because Heidegger clearly doesn't want to say truth is correspondence between something in my head and something not in my head, or between a language and something non-linguistic. He thinks this is all ridiculous. That's the idea of two realms and a bridge. He calls this Schildbürgertum, for whatever reason. Okay, but it's odd. But but that just won't do. Okay, so formally you get the liar if you have a purely formal theory of truth. Now what do you do? And I think Heidegger is well aware of this, and that's why he happily generates paradoxes. Well, here's what I want to do. I think that the formal concept of truth is a model for truth. Truth isn't a formal property. Truth is the property that every true proposition and every fact. I don't think that truth is restricted to sentential structures. I think it's a truth that Munich is in Bavaria, or it's a truth, and it was a truth when the Big Bang happened. Whatever that means, it was already a truth that the Big Bang is happening. Okay, so the truth has nothing to do with the existence of thought, sentences, utterances, etc. Well, it has nothing to do with an exaggeration, because they can be true, but it's not limited to that.
Well, Heidegger would not
No, that's why he's an anti-realist. Yeah, that's exactly why Heidegger is an anti-realist. Heidegger buys completely into what he rejects. Heidegger thinks only propositions can be true. He just has a funky view of propositions. He just thinks that they're only propositions because they're speakers. Yeah. And he grounds, that's why I think Heidegger is just a correspondence theorist. He grounds correspondence in something that is not correspondence, in Dasein. Yeah. Which is why he winds up with an ambivalent theory of truth, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. He thinks it has. Yeah. But yeah, so roughly that's the idea. So they're all the truth, okay, or they're not all of them, okay, but they are truth. And now we can say, you know, what is it for something to be a truth? And then your answer is going to be a formal property. And this formal property, left by itself, would immediately be subject to the liar paradox as I deal with it. Yeah. But that's why I bring in non-formal restrictions on the explosion of the model. That's why I call my view realist. And that's the deepest sense of realism to which I'm committed. That any interpretation of a formal symbolism will draw on non-formal material.
You want to
does this make sense?
From a Heideggerian perspective
I mean,
as you wish. You can also go open the debate.
I'll just say one thing, and then we can open up the debate. So I'm not completely understanding the distinction you're drawing between formal and non-formal.
I see. Okay.
Here, but maybe more to the point. I think, you know, from the let's say broadly phenomenological perspective, the question for characterizing a phenomenon, right, such as truth, is not is it a formal property, is it a non-formal property? It's rather what is appearing, what is showing up, what's the structure of what's showing up in this phenomenon just as such. And then I think to deny, you know, that there is a useful characterization of that is just, you know, ultimately, again, there's no kind of getting around it to deny that there's such a thing as truth. And so then you're maybe committed to that too, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean, okay, clearly in some versions of that, in some versions, you know, like I give you like well, sorry, but then we can open this up. But maybe this is something that that might be interesting for you. Let me just say, like, I'm committed to like a theoretically super enhanced, hopefully, version of Dennettian heterophenomenology. Yeah, he has no idea what he's saying, but he got something. Yeah.
Okay, please fühlen Sie sich frei, seien Sie mutig. Ich sehe Herr Weiß. Sehr gut. Ich muss dann das Mikro immer hin und her reichen.
Or maybe, I don't know, Paul also has a very strong voice, I think. Can everyone hear us? No? Okay.
I tried with the micro.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for the very interesting talk and the fascinating discussion. I have a question to something you, Mr. Livingston, mentioned earlier in your talk during your introduction. You referred to how can we make plausible Heidegger's version of realism, and you referred to the problem of predication. Well, this is a very interesting fact. I think it's also kind of almost a standard maneuver in German philosophy that there's a problem with predication. Yeah. Then you somehow realize there is this surplus that makes predication possible at all, some kind of a starting condition of predication. And then you start to wonder, how can we account for that, or how can we access that? I think this is a fascinating tool of diagnosis that lots of philosophers in the German tradition, not only Heidegger, exploited. And then they do something that I personally find absolutely terrible. They say we have to do a practical turn in some sense in order to access that. And I think you fall into some version of that, as you said. You refer to like this type of practical holism that Heidegger pursues, and you refer to the idea of a life form, and you quoted Wittgenstein. So I'm deeply skeptical of the idea that this type of practical turn can really help us with this mysterious surplus that we discovered by means of theoretical problems of predication. But obviously you do. So could you elaborate a bit on why you're convinced by this?
Yeah.
Klare Frage.
Yeah. So, okay. So actually, I'm not convinced by the practical, what you call the practical turn. Even though you're quite right, I'm using resources such as the terminology of Wittgenstein, Lebensform, and also Heidegger's references to a holism. But and this is more fully developed in the book, I don't mean by that to suggest anything that has an exclusively or even primarily practical, Handbook kind of significance. What I mean is something like a much closer, I think, to the fields of sense. Something like a context of possible disclosure. I don't mean to sort of say that it's all just a question of kind of instituted practices or something along those lines. As for the problem of predication, though, right? I do think that this is a problem. This is a real problem. And actually, I would locate its origin not, kind of in 20th century philosophy of language or recent German philosophy or anything like that, but actually in Plato. So just go to the Sophist, and in the Sophist we have this discussion of the possibility of admitting motion, change, time, and becoming into being itself over against the Eleatic position, the position of Parmenides. That time, motion, change don't exist. And this is answered, actually, with the first appeal to something like a structure of predication. Change is possible because it is possible to say something about something, and not simply to have a simple sort of, kind of one univocally determined just saying. Just the legein is the legein tinos. It's something about something. And so this is an old problem. And Plato certainly is not answering it by means of a pragmatism or a theory of practice. And I think Heidegger, in reading the Sophist in those lectures, also is not answering it in that way. He'll refer to hermeneutic conditions of the interpretability of world, and of course, famously in Being in Time, he'll emphasize some of the practical dimensions of that hermeneutic interpretation. But I don't think there's anything that makes it have to be about practices exclusively or primarily.
Ja, wir haben noch ein paar Minuten. Wer möchte noch sich beteiligen? Nur gut, es sind auch einige Studenten der Hochschule, die Seminare zum Thema belegen.
This is just an idea which came to my mind. I want to question why, like, the basic structure of the world of truth has to be in every way paradoxical. Like, when Heidegger is saying that the world is open or unveiled, it just means it's open for our interpretation. We can interpret what's coming upon us in the world. And I think he's stepping there in a line of thought which he's himself tracing back to antiquity, that the world is open for us for interpretation. And this is basically the thought of Aristotle, the prima materia, that the world in itself is being able to be determined. And I think that Aristotle is very similar to Heidegger. And the only difference I see is Heidegger saying, but this is in itself paradoxical. And I don't understand why, because Aristotle would say the world is being determinable, and then we can say a little bit about the basic principle of determination. Yeah. And just Professor Gabriel, you very often mention your example of making a list of the world, and the world doesn't exist because we can't make a list of the world. And I think Aristotle would say, well, the world is the paper you're writing on, so the possibility of making a list. And what is Heidegger's argument to say this is paradoxical, or this is not consistent?
Wunderbar, zwei klare Fragen.
So yeah, I would say you're right. The basic thing for Heidegger as for Aristotle is that it's open for interpretation. But we can say a bit more than that, and we should say a bit more than that. Particularly if we want to follow in some way Heidegger's question, which is about being, which is about the being of beings. And particularly then we can say, well, interpretation, I mean, yes, interpretation is open, interpretation is, with Aristotle, simply potentiality, but does this potentiality have a structure? Is it characterizable in some way? Obviously, and to say, of course, that the world is open to interpretation does not mean we can interpret it just any way that we want. So this is where I think Heidegger really is appealing to the specific structure of truth and its relationship to ontological difference, that is, to the difference between being and beings. And that gives, I just try to sketch, kind of broad formal terms in which that is sufficient, actually, to give us a set of paradoxes around totality and determinability. And if one wanted to read these issues back into Aristotle, into his conception of potentiality. I think one could do so, and find that conception of the writing pad, the blank, is paradoxical in a similar fashion.
Yeah. So yeah, just a word on Aristotle and why there are paradoxes, because I think Aristotle is just so incredibly ignorant. He has no clue. I mean, he thinks there's like stuff on Earth and some stuff falls down, and then there's a lunar sphere and a dude behind it, God, and 55 spheres and so. Like, if this is your knowledge of reality, then of course it's much easier to say, well, things are disclosed, right? I mean, so this is just a function of utter ignorance. I mean, also they have terrible mathematics degrees. So, like, this is, I think, this is, of course it's easier to talk about cosmos.
Not very good logic either.
And they have terrible logic. I mean, so like, I mean, it's an amazing advanced achievement, right? I mean, under those conditions. But clearly, under those conditions, you're way more likely to think of reality as a sphere surrounding you without asking the question, but where does the sphere exist, right? Because you're not even equipped with the logical tools to kind of formulate this version of a worry. It's kind of there, like pre-consciously in Plato, clearly. Much less so in Aristotle. That's part of what the tradition has perceived as his empiricism. But I think this just means that he's in an interesting way. I mean, this is not just a critique, in an interesting, more ignorant than Plato, because at least he's trying to figure out how things are, and Plato isn't. On this level. So, but yeah, that's why. But on the what you talk about, I think it's an epistemological issue. Right? I mean, so Aristotle has interesting things to say regardless of his empirical ignorance. He has very interesting things to say about the question, and this is why Heidegger goes back to Aristotle in this interpretation of truth, of course, as you know, right? What is it to be in touch with how things are, right? And you might say, to use your metaphor, right? If I make a list of what there is, right, tables and cars and whatever, and I write this down. And then you might say, well, there's, now metaphorically, there's of course a paper on which I write this down. Well, yeah, I agree, right? I mean, there need be a paper. I can imagine the list, I can write it on my notebook, and so on. But that's just saying, look, something's real. I'm clearly saying that. I'm a realist in all departments, as Davidson once called himself for very different reasons. But I just use this, I like the sentence, to be a realist in all departments. And but that means also that clearly that lots of things are real. I try not to have anything in my view which makes it likely to sound like as if it had any constructivist or obvious idealist sympathies. So I'm not denying in any way whatsoever that, for instance, Munich is real or I'm really here, etc., etc. But when I say what this means, right, so when I give an account of what it is for me to be really here, I will not want to mention a totality, right? I mean, it's tempting to say what it means for me to be here is for me to be one of those things that there are, right? Me, the moon, you, the past. But that's, I think, a wrong answer. So I think I agree with you. Also I think you're restricted, you're tamed Aristotle, regardless of the bit that you obviously didn't commit to is natural science or whatever, right? So I think your restricted bit is fine as it stands. But I think you can't avoid the paradoxes by just stating the correct epistemological realism. I think once you then ask the question, but what is it, right, for the world now in your sense, as what is disclosed to be, then you will have to choose minimally between Paul's and my model, and probably other models. I think in that sense, metaphysics is inevitable, in that sense of metaphysics.
And with respect to Aristotle, even if we ask, even if we ask, I would say, about the being of potentiality. If we ask, what is it fundamentally to be a dunamis, then we'll get into this same area.
Yeah, and that's something that Heidegger saw, right? If you look at his various readings of Metaphysics Theta 10, right, which is always his reference text for his account of truth, next to some bits and pieces from other passages, then I think he's clearly trying to show, right, Aristotle has to say something about totality in a way extremely uncomfortable for him. I think this is part of his reading. Yeah. Otherwise, he would just be an Aristotelian. I think this is where Heidegger is not nostalgic. Often there's the idea, well, isn't Heidegger saying we should all be good Greeks? I think he's not this kind of German. He's more like a Schäuble kind of German. The Greeks are like, okay, but look, they need a lot of discipline and blah, blah, blah. I think this is more the style of the argument. He's not nostalgic.
Wir haben 8:30, ich würde sagen, ist auch geplant. Sie haben heute einige Fragen wahrscheinlich noch. Also morgen und übermorgen gibt es die Antworten, nämlich auf der Konferenz Continental Realism der Hochschule für Philosophie. Um 9 Uhr geht es los. Euch beiden nochmal vielen Dank. Es war eine tolle Veranstaltung, sowohl der Input als auch wirklich die Diskussion. Die ging, glaube ich, wirklich zu den großen Fragen der abendländischen Philosophie. Und ich wünsche euch schönen Abend und Ihnen natürlich auch. Vielleicht sehen wir uns morgen. Vielen Dank.